Hello, welcome back to our YouTube channel. Recently, we have been talking about the life of King David and how his reign was different from that of King Saul's. And where we last left off, David had had an affair with somebody else's wife and had her husband killed. And then later on, a few years later, one of his sons raped one of his daughters, and then he didn't do anything about it, either as king or as a dad. He didn't do anything about it. And so one of his other sons, Absalom, decided to take justice into his own hands and killed his brother for what had happened. And where we last left off on Wednesday was Absalom then kind of got this idea in his mind that because he had started taking care of things and he had been administering justice, that he was probably a better king than King David. And so began talking to some of the people that King David ruled over, and really got them on his side, kind of being like, well, basically, I'm the king now, and because I'm doing stuff that the king should be doing. And David didn't respond in a very kingly manner. Once again, he didn't do anything about what Absalom was doing, except for that he kind of picked up everyone in his household and they fled because they were like, oh, well, Absalom's just going to kill us. And so they just kind of left, and David once again didn't really address the issue. And as we're going to see today, that not dealing with things just leads to more problems in the end. And so we are picking up in 2 Samuel chapter kind of 17 and 18.
Yeah, so although what King David had done was terrible, God had forgiven King David of his own wrongdoing. But the consequences of his decisions then just broke out throughout his family, and King David really didn't try to avoid these consequences or essentially help mend the problems within his own family and his own kingdom. Rather, he really fell away from them and didn't live up to what he's supposed to do as king and father. So when he left the capital and Absalom moves in, Absalom does terrible things within the capital as a consequence, really, of what King David had done. But King David now takes the time away from this situation in order to bring his own troops together, to bring them and form an army in order to take care of the situation of Absalom. And so then Absalom then brings his own people, his own army, in order to defend what he's already, accomplished and all of that, and get rid of the King David and his army. But, God was in the favor of King David. And King David had what was the more experienced army and the more experienced generals like Joab. So throughout the battle, really, Absalom just didn't have a chance at all. So this battle happened in a forest, and when Absalom saw that he was not going to win and the army of David was going to capture him, he decides to go off on his mule, really. And the thing that's interesting is that Absalom, one of the things that he also cherished was his very long hair, and he had supposedly very beautiful hair, but when he's going through this forest, the hair gets entangled in branches and then just yanks him off of his own mule, and the mule goes away, but now he's hanging there in the tree. Now, King David still loved Absalom as his own son, and he made sure to tell his generals in front of the whole army, if you capture my son, don't kill him, I still love him, really. But when the people that were with Joab came and told Joab, hey, Absalom is hanging essentially from a tree by his hair, Joab was like, well, why didn't you kill him? And it's like, but we heard King David say not to kill him. And Joab was like, well, I'll do it myself. And essentially impales him with a spear against the tree that he was hanging from. And while he is dying and in his last breath, his armor bearers start like just attacking and beating him and slashing at him in this very gruesome manner. Of course, the word of Absalom's death comes back to David, and David mourned for him, but David at that point realizes that Joab is not really a good, trustworthy general. Before, he had committed murder, and now he disobeyed his king's order. So, and David's now stuck with this situation with having a terrible general, but doesn't really do anything yet. Rather, what happens to Joab because of his own wrongdoing will catch up, but in a later time.
So really, all of this kind of starts and stems with King David. If he had dealt with his kids earlier, he would still have 2 sons that would be alive, technically. And then just kind of thing after thing that David didn't address. He didn't deal with his sons after the one raped his sister. He didn't deal with his other son after he murdered his brother. He didn't deal with Absalom taking over the city and trying to be king. He didn't try to even deal with Joab later on. And it's just like one thing after another that David just didn't deal with. And if he had just been honest about what was happening in his family, what was happening in his kingdom, and really sought God for direction, he could have had a completely different situation on his hands. But he didn't. And this kind of it leads back to his original sins that he started committing. And he might have had forgiveness from God for these things, but the fact that he had committed them and that God had told him that the sword wouldn't depart from his family because of this, it just kind of leads back to just thing after thing that has started going wrong because of what David had chosen to do and what he had chosen not to do. And so all of this goes to show is, one, when you have sin in your life and God calls you on it, deal with it. Don't just ignore it and try to make it go away like King Saul did. Deal with it first, like David did. But secondly, don't just pretend like it's just completely done, because it could have effects on the people around you. And if you don't help them, if you don't try to help make things better, then everything's just going to kind of spin a little bit more out of control. And 3, it just ultimately goes to show that we really need God in our lives to give us direction. And throughout this whole time, David still had God's favor. It wasn't like God had suddenly up and left him. In the same way that we still have God's favor, because God hasn't left us. And so we just need to make sure that we are talking to God about what he would have us do in different situations, and how we can best help God, have God help us in our lives with the people around us, in our different relationships and within our own families. And so I can't emphasize that enough, that it really takes God to help with different relationships and situations in our lives. And that's kind of what King David was lacking here. He didn't really ask God a whole lot about how to handle situations. He just kind of started making decisions and then asked God later about what he should be doing. And so it should be the other way around. You ask God first and then make decisions based on what God has told you. And so that kind of ends that segment. But King David is still the king. He goes back to Jerusalem and takes over back again as king. But his reign isn't done yet, and so there's still time for more mistakes and still more time for God's grace. And so we'll kind of talk about that more next time. And so we'll see you.
See you.